He was just a ranch hand with a busted wagon. But when he stepped into that snow-laced cabin, 3 towering women stood waiting, all widows, and none of them were ready to be alone again. The door creaked on its hinges like something reluctant to reveal the truth behind it. Thomas Wren stepped inside anyway, because the cold had finally chased him off his boots, and hunger gnawed loud enough to beat out caution. He didn't expect much. Maybe a quiet hearth, maybe nothing but rot and dust like most empty cabins left to die in these hills. But what he found rooted him to the floorboards like a man struck by lightning. 3 women stood around the hearth. Not just women, tall, broad-shouldered widows whose eyes had seen too much and bodies carved from survival. Their shadows stretched long in the firelight. Their hands, scarred and calloused, stilled as one as they looked up at the stranger now dripping snow and shame onto their floor. He couldn't speak at first, could barely breathe. One of them, a woman with ash-blonde braids thick as ropes and arms dusted in flour, tilted her head slowly, not smiling, not frowning either. She stepped forward just enough for the fire to catch the lines on her face. "You the one that left a busted wagon by the creek?" she asked. Her voice wasn't cruel, but it wasn't soft either. It was the voice of someone who had learned how to lead in a world where everything else kept leaving. Thomas nodded once. "Broken axle," he muttered, eyes flicking to the other 2. One leaned against the mantel, taller than the rest, with dark hair falling in a long curtain down her back. Her face was hard to read, shadowed and quiet. The third sat in a rocking chair, needle in hand, still working through a patch of worn cloth like she hadn't just been interrupted. Her sleeves were rolled, exposing arms thicker than Thomas's own. She glanced up with the same unblinking stillness as the others, like a hawk watching a mouse try not to tremble. "You strong enough for 3 widows?" The one at the hearth asked again, voice just a shade quieter this time, but it cut deeper. Thomas swallowed. "Ma'am, I just came in for warmth," he said, trying to pull the door closed behind him. But it was too late. The storm outside had been cruel, but the tension in the cabin was a different kind of sharp, one born not of malice, but of waiting too long for someone to carry a weight with them. The tall one by the mantel finally moved, her voice low, clear. "Name's June," she said. "That's Clara at the fire, and the one rocking's called me." Clara nodded once. "We don't get visitors often." Thomas shifted, snow dripping off his hat. "I didn't mean to intrude. I'll move along if this ain't." "You'll freeze before you're 10 steps down the trail," me said from the chair, not looking up. "Storm curling back round. You're stuck here now." Clara stepped aside, nodded toward the hearth. "Dry yourself, sit. Storm don't care if you feel awkward." He did as told, more from instinct than choice. The cabin was clean but rugged. One long table, a pair of bunks pushed against the far wall, and a tangle of animal pelts by the fire where it looked like folks had bedded down more than once. The walls were lined with tools, books, jars of dried herbs, and baskets overflowing with mended clothes. This was no waystation. It was a life, cobbled together and held upright by 3 women who had clearly given up waiting for the world to fix itself. Thomas peeled off his coat, the cold turning to ache in his fingers. He crouched by the fire, unsure whether to speak or stay quiet. In the end, it was me who filled the silence. "You got people?" she asked. Thomas didn't look at her. "No." "Wife?" "No." "Children?" He shook his head. "Had a brother, lost him last winter." A long silence stretched. The fire snapped softly. Then June spoke again, crossing her arms as she leaned back against the wood stove. "You work cattle?" "Yes, ma'am. Fence mending, hauling, branding too. Been riding for Granton's outfit south of Bitter Hollow till the floods hit and scattered half the herd." Clara glanced at me. Me nodded slightly, never stopping the stitch in her hand. June stepped closer, peering at him like he was a mule she was thinking of buying. "We've been holding this place down near 10 years now. No men. Lost hours the same season, different reasons." Thomas glanced between them. "You 3 together?" "We're neighbors," Clara said. "Were. When the war took June's husband and a fever took mine and Mies fell from a ridge trying to find food, we just stopped going back to empty cabins. Stayed here instead. Been working the same patch of land ever since." June crossed her arms. "But we're tired." Me looked up for the first time, eyes sharp and steady. "We need help, but not from a coward or a brute or a man who needs saving." Clara said nothing, but Thomas felt her gaze like a needle threading straight through his heart. He licked his lips. "I can work," he said. "Ain't afraid to pull my weight." Me set her stitching down and rose. The cabin shifted under her height. She wasn't soft, not anywhere. She stepped forward and reached out, not to strike or shake hands, but to press her palm against his chest, just over his heart. Thomas froze. She nodded once. "You're scared, good. Means you still got something inside worth breaking." He didn't understand, not then. But he stayed. Not because he felt needed. Not even because the storm outside had returned with a vengeance. But because there was something inside that cabin more dangerous than frostbite and loneliness. Something heavier, like purpose. That night the wind howled against the walls, but inside the fire burned steady. Thomas shared stew with the women, barely speaking. Me handed him a wool blanket that still smelled like cedar. Clara fixed him a cup of coffee so bitter it made his teeth ache. June gave him a list of chores before the sun had even set. He slept on the floor by the hearth, staring at the shadows on the ceiling, wondering what he'd just walked into. Wondering why a man who'd never been enough for anyone suddenly felt like he was being measured for something more than his muscle. He didn't know it yet, but the real storm hadn't come through the door. Not the one that blew through pine and snow. The real storm was the truth that each of those women held behind quiet eyes and hard shoulders. Truth that would crack something wide open before the week was out. Morning came like it had something to prove. Cold light filtered through the shuttered windows, catching on frost that clung stubbornly to the panes. Thomas woke with the stiffness of a man who'd fallen asleep braced for danger. The fire had burned low. He sat up, the wool blanket sliding off his shoulders, and blinked against the pale gray world pressing in from all sides. Voices drifted from outside. Women's voices, steady, unhurried, full of rhythm from years spent speaking only to each other and the land. He found his boots by the hearth, stiff but dry. The stew pot still hung over warm coals, so he ladled out a portion and ate in silence. Then he stepped outside. The cold snapped at his bones instantly. Snow lay heavy across the ground, but the trail down toward the creek had already been broken. A cow lowed in the distance. The barn door stood open, and that's where he found them. Me tossing hay like it weighed nothing, June hauling buckets of water with arms that didn't falter, and Clara bent over a sheep that limped along the far fence line, inspecting a wound like she was born doing it. None of them looked up when he approached, though Me gestured with her chin toward the shed. "Axes inside," she said. "Woodpiles short." Thomas didn't argue. He found the axe in a block already split and waiting. He didn't ask what kind of man they thought he was. He just worked. The axe bit deep. The wood sang apart, again and again. The rhythm settled him, drove the nerves out through sweat and sore shoulders. By midday, the woodpile was replenished and the women returned inside, all business. Clara handed him a basin and soap. "You stink," she said, not unkindly. "River S that way. If you're staying, we won't be having rot in our walls." Thomas went. The river was mostly frozen over, but he broke through near the edge and washed quick, teeth clenched so tight he thought they might crack. His skin burned from the cold and his hands shook, but something inside him steadied. This was real. This was work. And no one here was pretending. When he returned, June handed him clean clothes, his size somehow, and nodded toward the linta where she said he'd sleep until he proved he was just passing. It was little more than planks and canvas, but it held heat once a fire was going. Thomas said thank you. June didn't answer. They didn't ask for his past. They didn't tell him theirs. But that night, as they sat by the fire and shared cornbread and beans, he noticed something, June staring into the flames too long, me clenching her jaw when thunder rolled somewhere beyond the hills, Clara fingering the locket at her throat when no one was watching. Whatever had brought them together was more than grief. It was something unfinished. "Y'all ever get visitors?" Thomas asked cautiously, sipping at the bitter coffee Clara had become fond of forcing on him. "Only ones we don't want," June muttered. "Folks keep to their side of the hills," me added. "We like it that way." Clara gave a soft, mirthless smile. "People think strange things about women who don't remarry." Thomas glanced at them, unsure how to answer that. They weren't inviting conversation. They were warning him. Something had happened here, and it still hung in the rafters like smoke. That night he heard footsteps on the porch. Just one pair, not the wind, not animals, measured slow. He rose from his cot in the lean-to and stepped out barefoot onto the snow-dusted porch. June stood there already, shotgun resting across her forearm, her face blank. She didn't look at him. "Go back inside," she said. He didn't. "Who is it?" "No one worth naming." The footsteps stopped. A shadow hovered at the edge of the trees, watching, waiting. After a while it disappeared into the darkness. June did lower the gun. They always come back when it's cold. The next morning the air was sharp and silent. Clara made no mention of the visitor. Me chopped onions like nothing had happened. June only nodded once at Thomas when he stepped out with an armful of firewood. But the quiet had teeth now, the kind you didn't speak of unless you wanted to bleed. 3 days passed like that, routine, repetition, wordless expectation. Thomas worked hard, hauling water, clearing drifts, mending a broken shutter, digging out a root cellar half-choked with frost. The widows said little but watched everything. And in that watching, Thomas began to notice things. Me didn't sleep at night. Her chair rocked until the fire died down, and when he woke before dawn, he'd often see her outside sharpening tools, eyes fixed on something that wasn't there. Clara avoided the back pasture. Every time the trail curved toward it, she'd tense, change direction, hum under her breath like she needed to drown out the pull of memory. June kept maps, dozens, scratched in charcoal on old flour sacks, folded, rewritten, pinned to the walls in the loft, trails, names, symbols. He caught a glimpse of one once, a ridge line marked with an X and the word Lars scribbled above it. That night it snowed hard again. They all stayed inside, warmth and weariness pulling them close to the fire. Thomas tried not to stare, but it was hard not to when June pulled off her coat and revealed the thick scar across her shoulder, a wound too clean for battle, too ugly for an accident. "Bandits?" he asked too quietly. June didn't flinch. "Neighbor." Me spat into the fire. "He's dead." Thomas swallowed. Clara stood and began gathering dishes. "No one talks about him anymore." And that should have been the end of it, but it was. The next day, while hauling a salt lick to the goat pen, Thomas found a shallow grave behind the smokehouse. Not fresh, but not old either. A cairn of stones. No name, no cross. He didn't ask. But that night, when June handed him a list of supplies to fetch from town, he saw it for what it was. "Trust. I can leave at first light," he said. Me looked up from her knitting. "You'll come back." He didn't hesitate. "Yes." Clara studied him a moment longer, then nodded. "Don't forget coffee." He smiled, wouldn't dare. But as he lay back in his cot that night, listening to the wind rise again, the unease returned. He had come here by accident, had knocked on a door just to escape a storm. Now he was wrapped in something deeper than snow and far harder to crawl out from. These women didn't just need a hand with wood or beasts. They needed someone who wouldn't flinch when truth came knocking. And something told him that knock was coming soon. The sun rose slow and reluctant, sliding across the hills like it didn't trust what it would find below. Thomas had packed the wagon tight, blankets, trade goods, a list scrawled by Clara's neat hand, and hitched the mule before dawn. June met him by the gate, arms folded over her coat, her face unreadable in the dim light. "You ride straight," she said. "No stops, no detours, don't mention this place." Thomas nodded. "I understand." She handed him a pouch. Coin, enough for the supplies and a little more. He took it without counting. She didn't ask him to, but her eyes lingered on his face a beat longer than usual. "If you're not back by sundown tomorrow," she added, quieter now, "we'll assume you chose not to." Thomas climbed up into the wagon, flicked the reins gently, and the mule started forward with a groan. The trail down the ridge was still packed with snow, but he knew the way. Wind's Hollow lay 2 days out and 1 day back if the road stayed clear. A quiet town nestled between Cedar Woods and Riverbend. He'd been through it once years ago, remembered the livery, the dry goods store, and a church with a crooked bell tower. The journey down was uneventful at first. He passed frozen creeks, twisted trees bent under snow, and old trail signs half swallowed by ice. But something hung in his chest like a stone. He kept glancing over his shoulder, like the cabin and its 3 widows might vanish before he returned. By late afternoon he reached the outskirts of Wind's Hollow. Smoke curled from chimneys. A dog barked in the distance. A rider passed him going the other way, eyes narrowed, mouth tight. Thomas didn't return the look. He guided the mule straight to the livery, unhitching with stiff fingers. Inside the dry goods store, the stove blazed. A girl behind the counter looked up with curiosity as he stepped in. "Haven't seen you before," she said. "Storm didn't catch you up in the hills, did it?" "Close," Thomas replied. He handed over the list. Her eyes scanned it. "This is a lot. You sure you're alone?" He didn't answer and she didn't press. She gathered the items slowly, placing tins and sacks onto the counter. As she worked, an older man entered from the back, eyes narrowing as he saw the list. "Who sent you?" he asked gruffly. Thomas met his gaze. "I'm just running supplies." The man grunted, then leaned over the list. His finger paused on one item, alum root. "Odd request this time of year." "Someone has been tending goats. Used for wounds," Thomas said, keeping his tone even. The man didn't blink. "They still up there?" Thomas said nothing. The man exhaled, slow. "Best they stay up there. Word is someone's still looking." Thomas gathered the supplies, paid in full, and loaded the wagon without another word. That night he stayed at the livery, tucked under a threadbare blanket, sleep shallow and dreamless. At dawn, he rode hard for the hills. The climb back up the ridge was brutal. Snow had thickened, the mule's hooves slipping often, but he pressed forward, every breath a vow. He wasn't the kind of man who broke promises, not anymore. When the cabin came into view, dusk was settling. Smoke curled steady from the chimney. Light spilled from the windows, and a strange warmth spread in his chest. He knocked once out of habit. "Me open the door. You're late." "Storm," he said, brushing snow from his shoulders. "But I'm here." He hauled in the sacks one by one. Clara clucked her tongue at the flour's weight. Me checked the knives he'd sharpened in town, and June, watching from the table, said nothing at all. Later that night, they sat around the fire. Thomas passed out the tin cups of coffee. Clara sniffed the beans and nodded in approval, and for a while everything was still. "You saw someone," June said suddenly. Thomas didn't pretend he hadn't. "At the store," he admitted. "The man there he knew, didn't say names, but he knew." Me stared into her coffee. "They always know." Clara tucked her knees under her blanket. "We stayed too long, too quiet. Word gets curious." Thomas frowned. "You said no one came here." "We said they didn't come often," June corrected. He leaned forward, elbows on his knees. "Then tell me who's looking, why?" Me stood slowly, crossed to the hearth, and pulled a tin box from beneath the woodpile. She handed it to Clara, who opened it with trembling fingers. Inside were papers, yellowed, creased, folded. Clara spread them on the floor. birth records, marriage licenses, land deeds. And a letter. Thomas read it slowly. To whom it may concern, if any trace of the Crowley lands or heirs is found, report directly to Mr. Joseph Crowley of Red Hollow. Substantial reward offered. He looked up, throat dry. Crowley, he asked. June's husband, Clara said. Was, June corrected. Me's voice was like gravel. He left her for dead. Thomas felt cold all over again. Then why would he want you back? He doesn't, June said. He wants the land, wants proof we're gone, or enough leverage to take what's left. Thomas looked at the papers. Then why stay? Why not leave the ridge? Because it's ours, Me said, her voice iron. We bled for it, buried for it. We know the land, Clara added. It listens to us, shelters us. Thomas didn't argue, he couldn't. The fire crackled louder now, wind howled outside, and the truth settled over him like another weight in the snow. These women hadn't just been hiding, they'd been holding a line. He lay awake long after the others had gone to sleep. The fire's glow danced on the rafters. Every creak of the wood, every sigh of the wind outside set his nerves on edge. In the stillness, he thought he heard footsteps again, but when he opened the door, the porch was empty. Or so he thought. 2 ridgelines over, a lantern flickered once, then vanished. By morning, the snow had crusted over, a thin, brittle layer that cracked under every step. Thomas was up before dawn, already saddling the mule to check the trails beyond the cabin. June met him outside, her coat pulled tight, rifle slung across her back. She didn't ask where he was going. He didn't need to explain. Check the eastern ridge, she said. That's where they'd come from if they knew what they were doing. He nodded, and together they rode in silence past the frozen stream, along a narrow trail half swallowed by ice. It was treacherous in spots, the path barely wide enough for the mule. Every branch that snapped underfoot felt too loud, every bird too quiet. Near a bend in the trail, Thomas dismounted and crouched. A boot print, not his, not June's, wide, deliberate, and recent. He looked up and her eyes confirmed it. She saw it too. Too clean for a trapper, she muttered. Too fresh to be old. Thomas followed the tracks as far as he dared. They disappeared beyond a copse of pines, but not before he found something else. Scraps of cloth tied to a branch, bright red, torn and fluttering like a signal. He plucked it free and held it up. Marker. June nodded grimly. For someone who doesn't know the land, trail signs. She glanced back toward the cabin. They're coming. Back at the cabin, Clara and Me were already inside, tension in their shoulders, eyes shifting toward the windows more often than before. Thomas placed the red cloth on the table. Me stared at it a long time, her jaw set tight. I told you, she said finally. We should have burned the lower trail last fall, let the trees cover it. Clara looked up. And then what? Trap ourselves in, live like hunted beasts. June spoke quietly. We were already living that way. The argument didn't flare, but it lingered, an old fire smoldering beneath tired ash. Thomas left them to it and walked out toward the barn. He needed to work, needed something he could fix. The fence near the goat pens had buckled under the weight of snow. He reset posts, lashed new rails, and stacked stones to brace the corners. The cold didn't bother him anymore. It was something solid, something honest. By the time the sun dipped low, the cabin smelled of stew and rosemary, but the air inside was taut. Me had brought out the old trunk again, this time laying its contents bare. Inside were the weapons, rifles cleaned and oiled, knives wrapped in cloth, a hatchet Thomas hadn't seen before. These weren't tools. These were defenses, leftovers from another life. Do you know how to shoot? Me asked, not looking at him. Yes. Can you do it when it matters? He didn't answer right away. I can. Clara sat down, folding her hands in her lap. We can't leave, but we also can't wait. Thomas nodded slowly. Then we don't wait. For the next 3 days they worked. patrols on the ridges, trap lines laid quiet under the snow, snares rigged for two-legged threats, not rabbits. They built barriers out of logs, reinforced the cellar door, and turned the cabin into something more than shelter. They turned it into a place that could hold the line. And in those days, something shifted. Thomas noticed it first in the way June started handing him tools instead of telling him where they were. The way Me let him load the firewood without checking behind him. The way Clara asked what he thought of her stew, not because she needed praise, but because she wanted an honest opinion. Trust, not given all at once but offered like rations, sparingly, carefully, deliberately. One night the four of them sat near the fire. The storm had passed again, but the wind still whispered outside. June sipped from her cup, then set it down. "My husband wasn't always cruel," she said, her voice low. "But once the money dried up, something in him cracked, blamed me for the land going bad, blamed me for the baby dying." Thomas didn't move. "One night he locked the door and poured oil near the chimney," she continued. "Said he'd rather watch it burn than lose it to the debtors." Clara's hand shook ever so slightly, but she reached over and touched June's. Me stared into the fire. "Mine died with kindness still in his eyes," she said. "But not before I watched him waste away 1 inch at a time. I buried him with my own hands." Clara nodded. "Mine just vanished, went for supplies and never came back. Thought he'd fallen, got caught in a storm. But a year later someone came through from West Texas, said they saw him, new wife, new name." The silence that followed was heavier than any snow. Thomas looked down at his hands. "My brother was my only blood," he said. "We rode together since we were boys. He got sick, real bad. I left to find medicine. Took too long. When I got back, he was already cold." No one said anything for a long time, but the silence was different now. It wasn't loneliness. It was shared weight. They weren't alone in their grief anymore. That night Thomas couldn't sleep. He stepped out into the cold, boots crunching softly on the snow. He walked the perimeter, checking traps and markers, and then he saw it. A flare. Brief orange distant. Someone had signaled. He ran back, roused June and me. They came fully dressed, rifles in hand. Clara lit a lantern and followed silently. The four of them climbed the ridge behind the cabin, crouched low behind stones and snowbanks. Then they saw them. 3 riders, no torches now but close enough for shapes to take form in the moonlight. One was tall, with a wide hat and a long coat too clean for frontier riding. Another carried a rifle loosely over one shoulder. The third held the reins of a second horse, pack mule, heavy laden. They weren't scouting, they were settling in. "They mean to stay," June whispered. Me clicked her tongue. "They're waiting for us to move first." Clara's voice trembled, but her eyes were steady. "What do we do?" Thomas lowered the spyglass. "We don't run, not again." They returned to the cabin in silence. Plans were whispered, traps rechecked. The rifle barrel oiled one more time. The cellar stocked with enough food to last a siege. As dawn broke, a single figure rode up the trail toward the cabin. Thomas stepped outside to meet him. The rider dismounted, young, clean-shaven, but his coat was embossed with the Crowley seal. "Morning," the man called. Thomas didn't answer. "You the one staying here with the women?" Thomas said nothing. The man smiled. "Got a message from Mr. Crowley. Says he's making a claim on the land. Says if the women don't vacate, he's got papers to push it through legal." "This ain't a legal matter," Thomas said calmly. "This is home." The man shrugged. "Suit yourself, but Mr. Crowley don't like waiting." He turned and rode off. Thomas stood there long after the hoofbeats vanished. Because now it was real. They weren't just holding a memory anymore. They were holding ground. The wind shifted that afternoon, warmer than it should have been for the season. It carried the scent of thawing earth, broken pine, and something harder to name, anticipation maybe, or the last breath before a storm drops. Thomas worked the forge near the barn, shaping nails and bracing straps. June was up on the roof patching shingles, hammering with methodical strikes. Me moved in and out of the smokehouse with buckets of salted meat. Clara boiled water by the stove, her face unreadable. But the quiet between them had changed. It wasn't just the weight of labor anymore. It was strategy. They moved like parts of a living machine, each action reinforcing the others. No time was wasted. No questions needed asking. The land was preparing itself, and so were they. At midday, me motioned Thomas over. She held a box, wooden, old, the kind people buried in dirt cellars when they didn't want to be remembered. She opened it, revealing a revolver and 2 letters wrapped in oilcloth. "This was my father's," she said. "I haven't fired it in years, but it shoots straight, and I want you to have it." Thomas blinked. "Why me?" She didn't smile, didn't soften. "Because you came back." He nodded, took the weapon, and slid it into his belt. They didn't speak again. They didn't need to. That night they drew maps around the table. June laid out the terrain, the known approaches, the ridgelines. Thomas pointed to the south trail. "They'll come from here. It's the easiest ride in." June nodded. "I've rigged 2 traps with bare teeth. If they bring horses, they'll be spooked before they even see the door." Clara added, "I've buried glass along the tree line." Me set a small pouch on the table. "And I've boiled lye for the windows. If they try to burn us out, they'll get more than smoke in their eyes." Thomas looked up at them. "You've done this before." June's eyes met his. "Not like this. Before, we just wanted to scare them off. This time, they're not coming to rattle chains." Thomas exhaled. "Then we don't rattle either." That night the snow fell again, light at first, then heavier, faster, blanketing the world in a hush so complete it seemed sacred. But no one slept. They sat near the fire, not speaking, just listening, to the storm, to the silence, to the breath in their own lungs. And then, in the darkest hours before dawn, the dog barked. Not once, 3 times, low, urgent. Thomas was off the floor before the others stirred. He grabbed the rifle, stepped into boots, threw open the door. June was already behind him, loading her own. Me lit the lantern. Clara herded the goats into the cellar without needing to be told. Shapes moved beyond the pines. Thomas raised the scope, peering through the snow. 3 riders again, same as before, but now there were more, 2 on foot dragging something, stakes, rope. "They're setting camp," June said quietly. "No," Thomas muttered, "they're boxing us in." They moved quickly now. Windows shuttered, lamps snuffed, weapons placed in reach of every doorway. A bell hung on the inside of the root cellar, rigged to jingle at the slightest touch. Clara poured oil across the snow behind the barn and lit it. A line of flame burst to life, forcing the intruders back from that side. And then the waiting began. Hours passed. The sun did not rise bright. It crawled over the ridge reluctantly, and the snow turned from blue to gray. Crows circled overhead, uneasy, like they sensed something foul beneath the crusted snow. Thomas sat on the front stoop, rifle across his knees. Me stood behind the door, shotgun resting across her arms. June paced. Clara prayed. It was almost noon when the first shot rang out. Not aimed, not meant to hit, just a declaration. Me muttered, "Fools always think noise is power." Thomas stood. "They're waiting for us to come out." June joined him. "Let's not oblige them." Another shot, this one closer. A bullet hit the window shutter, splintering wood. Clara ducked, heart in her throat. Then silence again. Thomas squinted into the trees. He could see one of them now, tall, broad, pacing between trees like a wolf waiting for hunger to drive its prey into the open. "I've got half a shot," Thomas whispered. June shook her head. "Not yet." Me rolled her shoulders. "We wait." And they did. But by dusk the game changed. Smoke. Not from the chimney, From the back pasture, a column rising dark and angry. "They lit the barn," Clara gasped. Thomas cursed under his breath, already running. June followed, me close behind. Flames licked at the sides of the barn, and the heat roared against the cold wind like something alive. The goats bleated in terror from the cellar, but the horses, they were still in the barn. Thomas didn't hesitate. He ran through the side entrance, heat searing his skin. June pulled the doors wide. Smoke poured out like a wave. Thomas cut the horses loose one by one, slapping flanks, shouting over the roar. The beasts bolted into the snow, eyes wild, steam rising from their bodies. A shot rang out too close. Me fired back from the tree line, another shot, then a scream. Thomas grabbed the last rope, led the final horse out just as the roof began to collapse. June dragged him backward, both of them coughing, eyes red. Clara met them with blankets. Me's hit. They ran back toward the house. Me was kneeling behind the shed, blood running down her left arm, but her eyes were focused and cold. "Just a scratch," she said. "Got one of theirs, he ain't getting up." Thomas knelt beside her. "We need to pull back." Me nodded. "I'll cover." But before he could move, another noise cut through the snow, the sound of a horn. A low, guttural blast from deeper in the woods. Not an animal, not wind. "A signal." "More coming," June said flatly. Thomas looked out over the ridges, heart pounding. "They're calling reinforcements." Clara's face was pale. "How many?" No one answered, because no one knew. That night they buried the man Me had shot, not out of mercy, not out of respect, but because he was there and they weren't about to let him rot near their food supply. Thomas and Me dug the grave together. June stood guard. Clara lit a lantern and held it steady with shaking hands. The snow returned before midnight, erasing tracks, softening blood, silencing gunfire's echo. Inside, the cabin flickered with firelight and fatigue. Clara bandaged Me's arm. June sat polishing the rifle again. Thomas stared at the map. "They're not just trying to scare us," he said. "They want us to run." Me's jaw clenched. "Let them want." Thomas leaned forward. "We've got one shot at ending this. Hit them before they call more, cut off the signal." Clara looked at him. "You mean go out there?" He nodded. Me set down her cup. "Then we go tonight." "No," June said, voice like stone. "Only one. If we all leave, the house falls. We divide, we break." Thomas stood. "I'll go." The women looked at him, and for a long moment no one spoke. Then Clara rose, crossed to the old trunk, and pulled something from beneath the lining, a compass. She pressed it into his hand. "Follow the horn." Thomas nodded once, pulled on his coat, and stepped into the cold. Behind him, the cabin glowed like a beacon in the dark. Ahead of him, the ridge waited. The cold hit harder the higher he climbed. Snow had crusted in uneven layers, the kind that shattered underfoot and made every step louder than he wanted. Thomas stayed low, breathing through his nose, his coat pulled tight around his frame. The horn had sounded from the east ridge. He was sure of it. A place of broken trees and sharp drop-offs, where the land grew stubborn and the wind didn't carry right. It was the kind of place you scouted if you didn't know better, or if you thought you owned everything you stepped on. He passed through dense thickets, every limb clawing at his coat, each gust reminding him just how alone he was now. The stars were high above him, sharp and cold like judgment. His boots crunched through frost and pine needles, the sound buried under the occasional creak of a settling branch or the low groan of wind squeezing through the trees. He found the first sign near a ledge, a boot print deliberate facing downhill, then another. Then a piece of torn cloth snagged on bark. Thomas crouched low and listened. Nothing but wind, but the quiet was wrong. It wasn't natural, it was waiting. He slipped his rifle off his shoulder and moved slower now, circling toward the clearing that lay beyond the ridge crest. He crawled the last 20 yards, belly scraping over snow and dirt, the freezing ground biting through his clothes. When he finally saw the camp, he stopped breathing. 3 tents, a fire low but alive shielded by a ring of stones, 4 horses tied to a post, and 5 men. They weren't bandits in rags or drifters looking for shelter. These were professionals, clean coats, polished boots, rifles stacked neatly by the fire, and one man, seated slightly apart from the others, wore a coat stitched with gold thread along the cuffs. Crowley's men. Thomas watched as they spoke in low tones, passing a bottle, occasionally gesturing toward the ridge. "They'll be dug in by now," one said. Another spit into the fire. "We give 'em 3 more days, snow'll push 'em out, hunger will do the rest." "Or fire," a third muttered. "Saw smoke, bet the barn's gone." The one in the fancy coat, Thomas assumed he was in charge, stood slowly. "We want them desperate, not dead. Mr. Crowley wants them out, wants a clean transfer. Doesn't look good on paper when women start turning up burned." Laughter followed, short and cold. Thomas pulled back, heart hammering. He'd heard enough. They weren't going to stop. Not with reason, not with time, and certainly not with the cold. These men were paid to wait, paid to dig out every last root of resistance until nothing remained. He circled wide, made for the far trail. But he'd gone only a dozen yards when he stepped wrong. Snow gave way underfoot, sending a shower of ice and dirt down the ridge. He caught himself against a tree, barely holding his rifle. Shouts behind him. "Did you hear that? West side move." Thomas ran, not stealthy now, not quiet. He bolted down the ridge, weaving between trees, ducking under branches, his breath burning in his lungs. A shot cracked through the air, bark splintering near his shoulder. Another missed wide. But he knew this land better than they did. He cut left at the ridge's bend, slid down a frozen slope, tumbled once, regained his footing, and didn't stop. Behind him, more shouting, dogs barking. Dogs. He hadn't seen them in the camp, but now he heard them. Low, angry howls, eager for blood. The kind of dogs that didn't stop once they were given a scent. He reached the creek and jumped, barely clearing the ice-crusted edge. He sprinted up the other side, boots sliding, knees screaming. He didn't stop until the cabin came into view, a distant glow through trees and storm. He slammed into the door, breath ragged. "They're coming," he choked. "With dogs, 5 men, maybe more." June grabbed her rifle without a word. Me rose with surprising calm, shotgun already in hand. Clara stood frozen. "Go," June barked. "Cellar now." Clara moved. Me began lighting lanterns. June tossed Thomas a canteen. "Get your wind back, we hold the porch. They're coming for fire, we give them hell." Thomas took a long pull, wiped his mouth, loaded the rifle. "Me," he said, "the back fence, did you trap it?" She nodded. "They try to flank, they'll lose a leg." Clara came back breathless. "Horses are inside the root cellar, goats too, we're sealed." The first dog came howling through the trees. Me shot it before it cleared the fence. A man screamed behind it, his own dog turning back, biting at his leg, confused by the shot. Thomas saw him through the trees and fired. The man went down. More movement, 2 shapes rushed the porch. June hit one square in the chest. Thomas dropped the second with a shot that kicked up snow and blood. The third man ducked behind the wood pile, returning fire. Bullets splintered the shutters. Inside, Clara stayed low, feeding rounds into a rifle, hands shaking but steady. Me fired twice more, 2 down, 3 left. "Dogs are backing off," Thomas called. June stood, adjusted her sights. "They want to burn us." From the trees a bottle flew, a rag aflame. Thomas turned and fired before it landed. The bottle exploded mid-air. Flame lit the snow, flickering against the trees. Screams. Another man caught fire, the others ran. For now, the shooting stopped. Wind howled. Smoke drifted from the snowbank. June lowered her rifle. They'll regroup. Me nodded. We hurt them, but not enough. Clara stood slowly. We won't survive another night like that. Thomas turned to the map again, breath still short. Then we end it now, while they're bleeding. Silence. Then June spoke. You thinking what I'm thinking? Thomas nodded. We burn their camp. Me's eyes lit with something fierce. They want fire, let's give it to them. Clara stepped forward. Let me come. Me shook her head. We need someone here, in case they circle back. Clara looked down. June touched her arm. You've done enough. That night they packed oil, torches, and powder. Me rigged satchels of dry pine needles soaked in kerosene. Thomas loaded extra rounds. June gathered tinder. No one spoke about what might happen if they didn't return. The plan was simple. Thomas and June would take the ridge trail, circle behind the camp, and light it from two sides. Me would hold the far tree line with the long-range rifle, picking off any runners. They moved like shadows, wind covering their steps. By the time they reached the ridge again, the camp below was quieter. Two men sat by the fire. One paced. The leader, gold-trimmed coat, stood off to the side, talking to someone in hushed tones. June tapped Thomas's shoulder. There, she whispered. Saddle bags, oil, powder, aim for it. Thomas nodded. They moved down opposite sides of the ridge. Me's first shot rang out. The leader dropped. The men screamed. Thomas tossed the first satchel. Fire caught fast. June lit the second. Wind fed the flames like breath into a beast's mouth. Chaos exploded in the clearing. Horses screamed. Men scattered. Another shot, me again, dropped a man running uphill. Thomas fired into the confusion, not to kill, but to drive them out. Within minutes, the camp was gone. Nothing left but fire and smoke. They didn't wait to see who ran or who stayed. They ran. Back through the trees, down the slope, toward the cabin that still stood waiting. Behind them, fire roared. Behind them, the wind howled approval. When they reached the porch, Me was already there, eyes sharp, breath steady. Thomas dropped to his knees. They won't come back, June said quietly. Not after that. Clara opened the door. And for the first time since the snow began, Thomas stepped inside not as a guest, not even as a worker, but as something else entirely. One of them. Dawn broke slowly the next day, as if even the sun was cautious after the night they'd endured. Pale light filtered through frost-laced windows, touching the scorched edges of the woodpile, the blackened barn frame now reduced to char and bone, and the soot-smudged faces of four people who had stopped being strangers somewhere between a single knock and a war for survival. Inside the cabin, the silence was not heavy. It was sacred. The kind of silence that came after a storm, the kind that asked for reflection but offered no answers. The fire had burned low, but no one rushed to feed it. They sat with mugs of thick coffee clutched in bruised hands, eyes distant but still aware of each other. Clara leaned her head against Me's shoulder. Her cheeks were flushed, not from cold, but from the tremble she couldn't quite hide. Me said nothing, but one wide hand came to rest gently atop Clara's, her fingers covered in old scars, the kind that never fully faded. June stood with her back to the wall, arms crossed, watching the window like it owed her a debt. She hadn't spoken since they'd come in. Her face was blank, but her chest rose and fell with a breath that hadn't come easy all winter. Beside her, Thomas sat hunched forward, a rifle across his knees, though for once it felt more like a relic than a necessity. They won't come back, Me said at last, her voice rasped by smoke and cold. Thomas nodded. No, not after that. Camp's gone, leaders dead, even mercenaries know when they've lost. But Crowley's still alive, June said, her voice distant. Somewhere out there, he's still telling himself this land's his. Clara shifted. What does that mean for us? No one answered. Thomas broke the silence. It means he'll send more, maybe not today, Maybe not this month, but he'll come. That's what men like him do. They don't stop until something stops them. Me reached for her mug, sipped, and nodded slowly. Then we finish it. Clara looked between them. Finish what? Crowley, June said simply. The root, not the branch. A chill swept the room, not from outside, but from the weight of what was now being considered. Thomas met her eyes. You're talking about writing out. We ride to Red Hollow, June said. We end this where it started. Clara paled. You mean to kill him? June didn't flinch. I mean to stop him. Me stood, her boots thudding softly on the floorboards. We go together, all of us. No more waiting to be hunted. Thomas looked between them, searching their faces. Clara, hesitant but not protesting. Me, already tying back her hair. June, steel forged by fire and loss. And he knew he wasn't protecting them anymore. He was standing with them. That afternoon they packed the few weapons that remained, the rest of the dried meat, water flasks, maps, the old revolver from Me's box. Clara gathered blankets and the family Bible. June folded the last of the oilcloths. Me loaded the horses, her wounded arm still stiff, but she worked through it like pain was just another chore. They left the cabin just before dusk. 4 figures on horseback, shadows stretching long behind them. Snow crunched beneath hooves, and the trail wound down through the familiar woods, across the frozen creek, toward a valley none of them had dared enter in years. Red Hollow was 2 days' ride west. A town caught in the pocket between mountains and plains. A town where Joseph Crowley lived in a white-columned house above the church, behind iron gates, and a line of men paid to keep him from ever facing the blood he'd left behind. They rode in silence, camping beneath lean branches, taking turns on watch. Thomas barely slept, eyes always fixed on the fire, heart racing in quiet intervals. But it wasn't fear, not anymore. It was anticipation. It was knowing that for once in his life what waited ahead was something he'd chosen to face. On the second morning they came upon a wrecked wagon, burned out, skeletal. June stopped beside it, dismounted, and sifted through the snow until she pulled out a half-rotted ledger, the pages water-warped and brittle. She handed it to Thomas. Inside were names, transactions, a trail of property bought and claimed, mostly through intimidation or threats. The last 3 names made his stomach twist. Elijah June, forfeited land due to non-payment. Marlon and Me Baker, property absorbed after death, no heir to claim. Clara Reeves missing, presumed dead. He already erased us, Clara whispered. Thomas closed the ledger. Then we write ourselves back in. They reached Red Hollow as the sun dropped behind the pines, casting the town in a gold-tinted dusk. It looked peaceful, simple, wooden storefronts, smoke curling from chimneys, children playing in the muddy streets. But beneath it all was the rot. You could feel it in the air. You could see it in the eyes of the men who lounged near the saloon, their coats too clean, their hands too idle. Thomas led the group down the main street, heads turning as they passed. 4 riders. One of them a man, 3 of them unmistakably women, tall, strong, silent. They stopped outside the church. Me dismounted first. We go now, she said. June nodded, straight to him. Clara remained on her horse, hands shaking. Do we have to go through the guards? We don't go through, June said. We go around. And they did. They circled behind the back alley, past the mill, down the side road that led to the orchard behind Crowley's estate. The trees were bare, but the fence wasn't guarded. Not here. Not where he assumed no one would come. They left the horses tied low among the trunks, then climbed the slope on foot. Thomas held the gate. June stepped through first. The house loomed ahead, lit from within, music playing faintly, piano notes trailing into the cold, laughter, a fire glowing behind tall windows. He was entertaining, holding court, surrounded by people who thought they were safe because their names were on deeds and their pockets lined with stolen land. The women didn't knock. June kicked the door in with one boot. Gasps erupted inside. Guests stood, startled. A servant dropped a tray. Crowley himself turned from the fireplace, a glass in hand, his hair slicked back like time couldn't touch him. His face went white. "You," he said. June stepped forward. "You remember us." He straightened, tried to laugh. "You must be confused, Me raised her shotgun. He froze. Clara stepped into the room, her eyes wet but fierce. "You wrote us off," she said. "You put us in the dirt before we were even gone." Crowley licked his lips. "What is it you want? Money, land, name it." June's voice cut clean. "We want your confession." He blinked. "To what?" "To what you did. To how you tried to burn us out. To how you sent men to finish what your signatures couldn't." The guests tried to leave. Me leveled her gun. "Sit," she ordered. And they did. Crowley stammered, "There's no proof." Thomas stepped forward, pulling the ledger from his coat. "Plenty of proof," he said, "and 4 witnesses." Crowley looked at the room, at the people who'd once laughed at his jokes, who now stared like they didn't know him. Clara laid the Bible on the table. "Swear," she said. He didn't move. June took a step closer. "Or I swear you won't walk out of here." Crowley raised his hand slowly, then he sat. His voice shook. "I, Joseph Crowley, under oath before God and man, confess to orchestrating the seizure of land through fraud and intimidation. I paid men to drive out June Elijah, me Baker, Clara Reeves, and others." He went on, each word heavier than the last. He named names, gave dates, and when it was done, Clara closed the Bible and stepped back. Me lowered her gun. June stared at him a long moment. "Now," she said, "you live with it." Crowley's face twisted. "You're not going to kill me." "No," June whispered, "that would be mercy." They turned and left, walked out into the cold night. Behind them, Red Hollow stirred. Whispers started before they even reached the street. Thomas held the horses. Clara mounted first, then me, then June. As they rode out of town, no one stopped them. No one dared. Thomas looked back once. He saw a man crumble in the doorway of his own house. The trail home felt longer, though it was the same dirt, the same hills, the same winding valleys that had carried them to Red Hollow. It wasn't just the weight of distance. It was the aftermath that rode beside them now, silent and unshakable. No one spoke for miles. The moon hung low overhead, trailing them like a witness. In the stillness between hoofbeats and frost-crushed branches, the truth of what they'd done sank deep. They hadn't taken vengeance. Not exactly. They'd exposed rot in the open light and let it fester on its own. Joseph Crowley's name would never carry the same weight again. And though justice in the West was a fragile thing, prone to crumbling under the pressure of gold and power, sometimes it was enough to tell the truth out loud in front of everyone who once dared look away. By the second nightfall, they made camp beneath a thicket of cedar. No fire, just blankets and soft breath against the wind. Clara curled between me and June, her fingers wrapped around the Bible as though it were the last remaining tether to the world that had once broken her. Thomas sat on the edge of the clearing, rifle across his knees, eyes scanning the dark. Not for enemies. Just for quiet. And when it came, he let himself breathe. "You still planning to leave after spring?" June asked from the dark, her voice low, half carried by wind. Thomas didn't turn. "That what you want?" "I didn't ask what I wanted," she said, tone dry. "I asked what you're planning." He glanced back, saw her sitting upright beneath her coat, firelight glinting off the steel in her eyes, though no fire had been lit. "I was planning to," he admitted. "Didn't think I'd be needed." "You're not," she said. Then she added quieter, "You're wanted." The words hit harder than any confession ever could. He stared at the snow, now crusted into glass by cold. For a long time he said nothing. Then he nodded. Then I'll stay." At sunrise they crested the final ridge. The cabin sat below, unburned, unchanged. Smoke drifted from the chimney. The fence still stood. The goat shed was still mended, but something had shifted in the land itself, like the trees leaned closer now, like the frost paused to listen as the four returned to what had somehow become a home. Me was the first to dismount. She stretched, boots hitting ground with a thud that startled the crows from the branches above. She stared at the cabin a long time before letting out a breath that sounded like the first one she'd taken in weeks. Clara followed, her coat flapping as she crossed the snow. She touched the side of the doorframe like it might vanish. "We're still here," she said softly. June stepped onto the porch without hesitation. She didn't look back, just opened the door and went inside like she never expected to find it any other way. Thomas stood by his horse a moment longer. His fingers were stiff, his legs sore, his thoughts a slow tangle of memory and future. He was not the man who had knocked on this door just to escape a storm. He was something else now. And the door didn't creak when he opened it this time. It welcomed. The next few days passed with a strange kind of peace. They restocked what little they had, repaired what had been damaged. Me cleared the ash from the burned barn and began sketching the frame of a new one. Clara swept the porch, sometimes humming old hymns no one had sung in years. June patrolled the tree line at dawn and dusk, not because she feared someone would come, but because vigilance was in her bones now. Thomas spent most of his time building a new fence. It wasn't needed, not yet, but it was something his hands knew how to do, and every time he lifted the hammer, he remembered the sound of Crowley's voice breaking in that parlor, remembered the way June hadn't blinked when he offered her land and gold in place of dignity. He remembered that none of them had raised their voices, but somehow the whole town had heard them. One morning, Clara approached him at the fence. She held a small wooden box. "I found this under the hearth," she said. "Been there for years, don't even remember putting it there." He opened it and found 3 wedding bands. Gold dull scratched. "They were ours," Clara said, "once." He closed the box gently. "Not anymore," he said. She nodded. "Can we melt them, make something new?" He looked at her, then toward the cabin. "Yes," he said, "we can." That night the forge blazed for the first time in a year. Me fed it steadily, her arms still sore but her stance strong. June leaned against the doorway, watching. Clara sat nearby, sketching something in the dirt, rings maybe, or keys. Or maybe just a circle. When Thomas poured the gold, they said nothing. When it cooled, they all watched together. Not as widows. Not as survivors. But as something that didn't need a name to be real. Weeks passed. Snow began to melt. The air shifted, smelling of thawed earth and pine needles. Goats birthed 2 new kids. Clara cried when she found them. Me grumbled that she didn't want more mouths to feed, but she built a new pen that very afternoon. June took to reading again, her voice steady as she read aloud while Clara mended socks and me carved new handles for the kitchen drawers. Thomas sat near the fire, listening to the sound of a life being lived. One evening, as the wind died down and the sky turned amber, Clara asked a question none of them had voiced. "What now?" Silence followed, but not the kind that held fear. Thomas finally spoke. "Now we live." And they did. The storm never returned, not that one anyway, but life did what it always does. It carried on with moments of laughter and quiet, with meals shared and fields planted, with fences built and books read aloud by firelight. And every now and then travelers came through. Some needed food, some needed direction, some just needed to see that not all roads ended in ruin. The cabin was never empty again, and though no one spoke of Crowley anymore, his absence was a presence of its own, a reminder that silence, when broken by truth, echoes farther than hate ever could. One spring morning, a little girl arrived at the porch, barefoot, mud on her cheeks, no one behind her. She knocked. It was a weak knock, barely more than a scrape. But even ghosts know better than to knock after dark. June opened the door anyway and smiled.